Stefanie Jegelka from TUM and MIT. Over to you, Stefanie.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for the invitation, and sorry for not coming in person. I broke my arm, and flying is not that great with a broken limb. So anyways, sorry about that. It wasn't as planned. Okay, so today I thought I'll talk about multimodality and different ways of basically how you could exploit multimodality in different settings. And all right, here we go. Well, we all know that the world is multimodal. We may be learning by hearing and seeing and touching and so on, and also via text. And since this is actually a workshop on AI, we know that this doesn't only hold for kids learning, but it also holds for many of the data that we care about. So this talk is mostly going to just use vision and text and things like that, but I think it's very interesting to explore some of these ideas also in other settings. And in fact, my first part does have some settings beyond just the standard like vision benchmarks also, and you see it's useful. So just as a disclaimer, but I think multimodality is interesting in many different settings. So why do we care about multimodal data? Let's just take a step back. Well, what does multimodality actually mean? It means basically that we have different views essentially of an underlying object, different data. So for instance, we have this ground truth. We take pictures with a camera. We have a textual description of the sea. And now the different modalities, obviously, because they're coming from the same source, they have shared content. So that means if they're essentially data about the same thing. So having more data about the same thing is usually good because I have more information about my data. So I can, for instance, align the different representations from the different modalities. And there's also this Platonic representation hypothesis that I'll get back to again and again, that models trained sort of on different data sets and even different modalities, they kind of converge to the same notions of similarity, meaning they are maybe starting to capture some underlying almost ground truth about the world, just captured from different modalities even. So you can align them. The other benefit is not only that you get more information sort of about the same thing, but there's also complementary information in the different modalities. So sometimes it may be actually beneficial to have multimodal data instead of just unimodal data, because you have some complementarity. Is one modality captures certain things more than the other one could. So that's why we may care. And what I want to do in this talk is I just want to show you a few examples of how multimodality can help you in different settings. And the first two parts of my talk are really more about how can we use multimodal data to even just improve learning tasks in one modality. If I really care about one modality, even then multimodality can potentially be helpful. And in the last part of the talk, I will take a step back and think a little bit more about sort of globally the geometry of these multimodal representations, and which is of course also something that is influential in the first two parts, but then to take a step back and see how do they correspond across different models. So I have now different modalities. Each model embeds different modalities. Are there correspondences in what these models actually learn, how these modalities relate? But let's start with just the question, how can multimodality potentially be helpful even in single modality tasks? And I have two examples. The first one is for generative models. So we look at diffusion models. And the second one is, well, general self-supervised and supervised learning, where you really care mostly about one modality, but you have the added complication that you have different modalities, but you don't have that paired view. And I'll go into detail what that means. So let's start with diffusion models. So we all know what are diffusion models. They are super helpful in generating lots of different things, for instance, images, molecules, and so on. So they are very flexible and very powerful, but at the same time, they're also pretty heavy to train. And one thing that they're having a little bit of a hard time capturing is good data representations. And there has been evidence that good representations help diffusion models a lot. So here's one example of an observation that people have observed, that actually if you train a diffusion model, all you want to do is really generate really good images or really good molecules or so. They still learn a representation of the data, a meaningful representation of the data. And in fact, that representation weakly aligns with representation learning models, like for images, maybe Dino or so. And the better the diffusion model, the better that alignment typically is. So somehow that better representation, or more aligned with some good representation learning model, correlates with better performance of that diffusion model. So this has led to the idea to somehow include like guidance on these representations in the diffusion model learning process, and to steer them to somehow learn better representations and to hopefully have that improve the model. So there's various ways you can do this. There are several works on it. You can do conditioning. One thing I want to specifically mention here is this REPA model from last year. So the idea is that you have your diffusion model and you say, it's actually trying to learn a representation. So what I'll do is I'll help it with an additional signal that its representation should align with that of a pre-trained model. So for instance, if I want to generate images, I have some pre-trained image encoder model, and I just take that thing's representation and I try to align the diffusion model's representation with that other model's representation as a guidance. So the other model is just fixed. It's sort of an additional loss or regularization, you may think of it. So we have the denoising objective and then the alignment objective. And this has been shown to be very useful in accelerating the learning process of that diffusion model and getting better results. And in this paper, this has been done for images. So I said, mostly this is like typical benchmark data. But one question is, can you generalize this to other modalities? So what maybe if you want to generate molecules or something like that, other types of sequences? The other question is, what about multimodality? So here we have an image, because this talk is also about multimodality. We have an image and we align that diffusion model for the image with a representation of images. But what if maybe we had actually more information about this object we want to generate? Maybe we have different modalities and they could maybe capture complementary information, different coarseness of information, and that could help. So I'll make it a bit clearer what I actually mean by that, but just to keep it in mind. So the question is how to include all of this. And to include all of this, I'll start with one slide that's a bit more technical about a bit of a general framework, how you could broadly think about a framework of integrating these latent representations and also multimodality into this diffusion model. So basically what we have in a diffusion model, we have this process of going between data and noise. So X naught here is the data, XT is the noise. So going from data to noise is the noising process, the forward process. And then the backward process is taking the noise and going back to the data. That's what we're learning. And now in addition, so this is just a Markov chain essentially. And in addition, we have this latent variable Z, which is, it's the embedding of X naught. So that's why it's hanging on that side. So what we'll do is we'll bring that Z directly into the equations that we have here. So the full form of these equations, you don't have to care that much about, but typically at this moment, of course, if you have to implement it, yes. What we optimize is a variational bound. And here we have this parameterization for this reverse process in there. So this is the p theta. The theta is the parameters you're learning. And then that's the process of going from the noise to the data. And here we bring in that Z explicitly and use it in the parameterization of our distribution. So what would this look like? Down there where I wrote this mixture of decompositions, you have an example. So basically you condition Z on some XT in this case, and then basically you have the conditioning of all the XIs before XT on Z. So these are the ones between the Z and the XT. And then for the rest, you just condition on the previous X. So we call this PT. And now the thing is, you can choose what your T is. So what is this T? Essentially, it determines a little bit where do you align your representations. Do you do it early in the process? Do you do it late in the process? Or closer to the data, closer to the noise? And there are trade-offs between that, and that's what you can choose, or you can choose a schedule between them. So a flexible way to do this is to say to take a mixture of these. The alpha T basically says how much weight do I put on like aligning it exactly here at T. And so for instance, this REPA model would do sort of a linear average over all of these. But you can do other schedules as well. Some of the other ones would just do like very close to the data or so. So you can recover some of these other models in this specific framework. So now this framework, it's just sort of to show you where the flexibility is. You have two types of flexibility. One is you can have this weighting schedule of basically at which T do you like, to which T do you want to align your latent. It basically tells you where in your hierarchy do you want to align. And the second one is, what is the latent? So here I just said Z is a latent variable, but in fact, Z could be multiple representations. And you could align these multiple representations potentially in different stages of your diffusion hierarchy. So here's a picture that may make this a bit more clear. So now if you think about this image, we have the noise and we are going like towards the denoised image. We could align this representation at different stages, and maybe at different stages, different types of representations may be more useful. So maybe closer to the noise, I would want something that's more low-level vision features. And as I go further up, I want something more high-level, more semantic, like maybe some representations from a vision language model or so. And there you already see, so this high-level representation, the text is usually more the high level. That's where multimodality could come in. So different modalities maybe give you information about different coarseness. And now if you can basically align multiple of these and align them in different stages, you are pretty flexible with that. The question is, where does the second modality come from? So maybe you have it. What we did in the experiments I'll show you is we actually didn't have them, but we generated them. So we said we'll do an additional representation essentially of my data, and that's what we align. And I'll show you these examples, what this may look like. So let's look at some actual examples to make this clearer. The first example is on generating images. So you have your diffusion model, you go from the noise, that's the input, to images. So this is the standard setting. And now what you do is you align this. And you align it, essentially you do the alignment that I'm showing here. The earlier layers are aligned with the lower level vision, and the higher layers are aligned with representations from a vision language model. So the lower level vision is just a self-supervised representation learning model. The vision language model, where does the language come from? So we have this image, and then we basically create a caption for that image, and then we align the representation with that caption. So this is what you can do in the training process. So the input is noise, the target is really the image, and now we are doing a multimodal alignment, both with an image representation and with a vision language representation. You have some flexibility of where you align it, and what we found is essentially what I said, that the images, you want to align them in the earlier, like, so this low-level image representations, you want to align them more in the earlier layers, and the vision language model representations, you want to align them in the higher layers. But you have some flexibility. Overall, this actually helps in making the model learn faster. So what this plot shows is basically how fast does the model learn. So the blue line is if you just use the diffusion model as it is. The red line is if you do this REPA alignment. So alignment itself helps a lot, but if you do multimodal alignment, it can gain you a bit more here as well. Now let me show you another example. So this is inverse protein folding. So inverse protein folding means, well, it's the inverse of the folding process. So you start with a structure and you want a sequence for that structure. So it starts out kind of with that empty sequence, and then you have to fill it in. So what could we align with here? So what we could align with as well, maybe some kind of embedding for sequences, amino acid sequences. But maybe also now if we want another modality, the other modality here would be the structure of the protein. So how do we get this? Well, we have a sequence we generate with a folding model, like AlphaFold in this case. We generate a structure, and now we have a multimodal embeddings for sequence and structure, different types of embeddings. So we have the sequence for the single, basically nodes in that sequence, and for pairs, and then we have the structure. And we align these at different levels. And now if you think about this inverse folding, it's the inverse of the folding. So basically, in the beginning, you would align with a coarser structure, like the global structural information from the protein structure. And then as you refine this, you want to align with single and pairs embedding. So that's the interactions of your amino acid. Does it help? So it actually helps in making the model about 3.5 times faster from just a discrete diffusion model to going to doing this one with the alignment. I also have some pictures here for you to look at. These are some of the results of the model. So these are proteins. So what we did here is you have the structure, you let the model generate the sequence, and then you generate the structure from the sequence again. And if the two structures, the original and the recovered one, they agree a lot, then you also have a good sequence. And this is essentially what this shows. So you see the blue and the green, that's how well do the proteins agree with each other. So it's a pretty good alignment. And so this is what this SC-RMSD basically captures. And usually you say between below 2 angstroms. So if this number is below 2, that's a useful model. So it actually, it provides quite a useful model. So the final example I have here is on molecule generation. In this case, your input is a point cloud, and what you want is you want to generate a molecule from that. So a 3D molecule. So of course you could align some representation, like some embedding of that 3D model with your diffusion model. What would be the other modality? So in this case, our additional modality was the 2D topology. So if you have the 3D model, you can extract basically from it the graph and the bonds, etc. And then you can have a representation of that as well. So our multimodal model has representations of the 2D and the 3D structure. And then we align both of these to the molecule model. And what you see in this table here is that typically this gives you the better results in the molecule generation as well. Okay, so it's a bit fast. Okay, so just in a brief summary, what we did in this work was we exploited the idea of using multimodality to have a better representation in diffusion models, which help it learn faster. So it's a better guidance essentially towards learning a better representation. And you can do this with a single modality, but the additional modality can help you sort of stabilize this process a bit more and add some additional information. And throughout, like in the later parts of the talk, maybe, there will be some ideas of why this could actually be helpful to have multiple modalities as a representation. Okay, so this brings me to the second part of my talk. This is about unpaired multimodal data, but it's also about sort of how the modalities can help each other. So for that, let's go back to this view of multimodality. So what I had told you in the beginning was that, well, we have essentially our ground truth world, and the different modalities capture sort of different snapshots of the same thing, which is also true. But what this also assumes is that we, like for the same object, we have the text and the image representation. And that's also what we had with the alignments. And this is a typical assumption that I have my underlying scene, and then I have an image of it, and I have a textual description of it. And what I'll try to do is I will learn a representation that aligns text and image. And this is what you do, for instance, in contrastive learning. And it has been used successfully in many representation learning methods. It also, well, the intuition is pretty clear. We say that basically the image and the text describe the same thing, so their representation should be pretty close in a shared space. And hence, then I can basically use one or the other. I can do retrieval. I can ask, like looking at the image, I can get a textual description for the image and so on and so forth. So it makes a lot of sense to have these. Well, ideally, you think about it having them on top of each other, that things that describe the same thing, their representation should be pretty close together. It's not exactly like that, but they are somehow in correspondence. So the only question, like the only challenge with this is that, well, in many cases, we have these data sets, or we can generate like synthesized data that is paired. It's two representations of the same thing. But if you collect data out in the wild, it's not always like this. So on the left-hand side, we have this ideal case that for each image, I have a caption and so on. So for each object, I have multiple representations of the same thing. What often happens is that you have a bunch of images and you have a bunch of text, and that's it. And there's no direct correspondence. You don't have a one-to-one correspondence between them. You don't know whether even there is like two of these that describe the same thing, or they're just general descriptions of the world, essentially. So the question is, if you have unpaired data, what can you do then? And why would we want to do this? Here's just a bit more motivation. Well, there are large data sets, at least for vision and language, so there are multiple large data sets that have these like paired data points. So we have an image and a text for that image. But there are even larger collections of just images or just text. And then basically, I mean, they come from different sources. Anything in Google Photos, it's not clear that it'll correspond directly to any kind of website or so. So we have these sort of unrelated databases of images, of text, whatnot. Of course, ultimately, they are all describing the same underlying world, but they are not directly now like per instance correspondences. And the question is, if you have data like on the right, you don't have one-to-one correspondences, can it still be helpful? So let's say I wanted to now learn a better vision model. Is the text helpful at all? Or can I just forget about it? So this is what I'm asking here. So let's say I have this collection of images and I'm learning an image classifier or something. And well, it's performing fine on my downstream task. Now the question is, I have this other big collection of text. Is it useful at all for my image model? And the question is when, maybe. So indeed, in some cases, it could be useful if there is some shared information between these models. So for instance, ultimately, there's the same classes of objects in there. So there are butterflies, like there's some text talking about butterflies, there's some images of butterflies and so on. And sometimes maybe the text has information that is not as visible in the images, maybe unless you really pointed to it, or it's not even directly there, and vice versa. So potentially there's some information that we could actually get from the language modality that would help us in classifying things better. For instance, it could actually tell us something, what's exactly the difference between the viceroy butterfly and the monarch butterfly. And like pointing this out, maybe it would help us decide between the two, rather than just looking at the images. So how could this happen and how could we exploit it? So I want to think about this a bit. So now the model here, so let's first look at a little bit of theory, and then we look at some experiments of how this could help. So the idea is that like we have some kind of ground truth reality. This is called Z star here. And then, well, we have different modalities that capture this ground truth reality. But now this is more as sort of the higher level, then it's not the instance level anymore. So for instance, the vision model, like it has the images and the text says something about this type of bird. And so now we model this as now we get instances xi's and yj's from the same ground truth reality, and they have some shared information. So even if they are paired, there's like some shared information. That's the theta c. So some aspects of this shared information are visible in xi and also in yj. And then there is the modality specific information, which is only visible in that modality. But the hope is that maybe because there's some shared information about the ground truth, seeing both modalities may actually help us in figuring something out about the ground truth. Because somehow what they extract from that ground truth reality is a little bit complementary. So maybe the text has some information in it that's not directly in the image and vice versa. And so here are some theoretical results that prove under what case this could actually happen. So let's say whatever, modality 1 is image, modality 2 is text. So if in the text, for instance, some of these BCJ matrices has full rank, so it's like it explores really like all the information in theta c, then adding samples yj to your data set actually helps you in recovering information about the theta c. So you can strictly reduce the variance if you include multimodal information rather than just including information from X. So for instance, maybe in X, some dimensions of information are sort of notoriously underrepresented, then the other modality can help you fix that. So things like that are not as visible in the image. The directional reduction is a bit like, so first one, you need full rank. The directional reduction says basically in certain directions, the data from Y can help you because it covers it covers that direction better. You have support in that direction. So basically it exposes that direction of information, that aspect, that feature of the theta c better, and hence you can infer that better than just looking at X. So this is the intuition between these formal results that you see on the slide. So you can formally show that you reduce the variance of the estimator, or you increase the information. Okay, what could this look like? Here's a toy experiment first. So this is just Gaussian data. And in the X modality, there are some dimensions essentially that are a little bit noisier, a little bit less well represented than in Y. And what you see here is you actually can see this in practice, the difference in between X only and X and Y data. So now first thing we do is we train only on X. So this is just with a variational autoencoder. And we see how well we do just in X. And so you see the reconstruction error here, and that's the pink line on the plot over there. Then we include data from Y. So this is really like if you would essentially also replace some of your data of X with data from Y. And in that case, you see you get an improvement. What do we do here? We think what we are actually trying to infer is about the same world. So we use actually a shared encoder. This is sort of the same thing. We are trying to find out something about this theta c. So we have the same model for the X and Y modality for that theta c. So that's the idea. So we have a shared model now where we feed in X and Y. We just treat them sort of as data, the same data. And because there's some complementary information in X and Y, it actually helps us in this case. So it visibly helps to have Y data in your model than just X. So having some Y's actually is more helpful than having more of the same thing. The inequality up there in my slide I see is wrong. It should be, of course, that you're gaining. So having Y actually helps you. It's not the same. Okay, but that's the intuition. So this is, of course, a toy model. This is very simple data. It's constructed. So what about the real world? What about, semi-real world? Let's look at some more realistic data. So the way we are going to exploit this is the same intuition. We are learning about basically the model about the same shared underlying truth. So we are going to use the same model and share weights. And now the only thing is we have modality-specific encoders and decoders to bring you sort of into that same place where we can process them together. That's the shared age. And now you can train this in a supervised way. You can train this in a self-supervised way by just basically, completing sequences, filling in gaps, and so on. Both of these are possible. So what's the idea? The idea is now that if I train on both modalities, even if I just care about images, the text modality is going to help shape that age part of my model, and it's going to help me guide that model in like learning better representations or better mechanisms in deciding down in there. I'll talk a little bit later what we found and what it may be learning. So that's the idea. So it's just basically shared weights. We care about only the images, let's say, but we also send text through the same model just in the hope that it'll increase the information that we have. Here are some example results. So this first one is on self-supervised learning. And the task here is the following. You have to recognize sarcasm. So you get some images and captions, and you have to recognize sarcasm in those videos. If you train this in a unimodal way, that's the first line here. And then what if you add the text modality to it? And adding the text actually helps the model, even if you later just determine the sarcasm or not just from the images. Here's another example. So now we're doing supervised learning and we're doing audio classification. So for once, we're not doing images. What you can do is, of course, you can just classify the audio by training an audio model. That's the green bar. So things like whatever you hear a sound, you have to say this is a dog or this is a clock and so on. And then you can pair this up with other modalities and do the same thing with a shared model. So for instance, you could add images of these objects, or you could add text. Of course, in this case, if you think about it, the sound versus the image or the sound versus the text, there's a lot of complementary information in there. The question is, does it help you to improve the audio classification? Even if you later, you only send audio through your model, you don't see later at test time, you don't see the other modalities. And it does actually. So you see that like in these bars, the bars increase. So both image and text actually help that classification. This experiment shows out of distribution robustness. So what we have is we have an image model and then we add text to it. And then, so we train it on ImageNet and test it on other variations of ImageNet. Those are distribution shifts. And the question is, does it also help you to be more robust to distribution shifts if you add other modalities? The idea may be being that as long as you stay in your data, well, these sort of dimensions of the theta c that you're seeing well, like they help you, but maybe with a distribution shift, you would actually be grateful about other like aspects of your data. And indeed, this is the case. So you see that there are increases in accuracy if you do the multimodal versus the unimodal model. So again, it helps. So it helps just the model's performance in general on the same data, but it also helps the robustness to distribution shifts. And finally, I want to just show you some other visualizations and a little bit of an exploration of what this model may be doing. So here's a visualization of a decision boundary of the unimodal model. So this one is trying to distinguish different types of cats, and it's making a mistake with a cat in the red. So this is the test image. So it puts that test image is a little bit different from your other images. So it's a little bit out, like away from the other images. And on the right-hand side, you see what happens to the decision boundary if you train the model in a multimodal fashion. So same model, but now we are adding text. And so basically what the text is, you get text and you try to classify the text and you try to classify the images. And what this text does is it shifts the decision boundary. So before that, the red test image was grouped with that gray cat on the right-hand side. And now the decision boundary goes like between them, and the test image is classified as the other type of cat. So what the text essentially does here is it shifts the decision boundary, and that may be a reason why it makes it more robust or improves the performance on cases where the decision is actually hard, because it's a little bit away from your data and so on. Another question is, so it helps somehow, it shapes your decision boundary and it does change your decision boundary, but like what exactly may be actually shared here? So the first thing you may think is that, well, okay, I have vision data, I have language data. Maybe all it does is it really aligns these two modalities fully, 100%. It doesn't. And I'll show you later that even the clip models don't. So it doesn't do that. It somehow changes the representations a bit, but it doesn't fully like put text and image of the same thing. It doesn't put them together. But somehow it still seems to be learning shared features, shared subroutines or something like that. So for instance, what you see is that we call these multimodal neurons, they come up. So if you go back to this sarcasm example, there are some neurons that fire when there is, the input is sarcastic, and some that fire when it's not sarcastic. And now we find a correlation, a cross-model correlation between these. So for instance, that's what you see here. So the correlation is high for non-sarcastic data. So there's neurons that sort of recognize the same thing, the same class essentially, for both text and images. So they emerge. And there are some that are more like just one modality, and there are some that are both modalities. But there is some information that is being shared across the modalities that somehow captures some shared properties or so. What exactly, I don't know, but just like, so there are these neurons you can find that are have very correlated behavior across the different modalities. So this was all I wanted to say about unimodal data. So the takeaway message is that even if you care about one modality and you do not have this paired data that we use for training these clip models and the typical multimodal models, it can still be helpful, because there's still some information that is being transferred between the modalities, especially if they carry complementary information. A little bit the complementary information we also used in the first part. What is an interesting question is how exactly do they share that information? What exactly is the mechanism? And I showed you we have these multimodal neurons, but the exact mechanisms, I would say, is a little bit open. I don't really know. It's a little bit like not as clear because there's no clear alignment. So it's a little bit less clear what exactly it's doing, but it's extracting some useful shared information, maybe more at sort of a mechanistic level or so. Okay, so with that, like a little bit of an open question, I want to go to the last part of my talk and think a little bit about correspondence of multimodal representations between models. So this is again going to be about, multimodal embeddings, but usually paired. So this is partially inspired by this, the observation that if you train models on different data, but let's say you train a vision model on one data set and a vision model on the other data set, and they're sufficiently large, somehow the embeddings of these models, they correspond in some way on this, and this correspond in some way is typically measured as some sort of alignment, but the alignment is measured as an alignment of their similarities, because similarity is very important in machine learning. And this happens even for models that are trained on different modalities. So one is a vision model, one is a text model, and somehow their representations somehow correspond in some way that we can do an alignment between them. So the plot here shows some example that even language models, basically, they align well with vision models, and the better models align with the better models, essentially. So there's some correspondence between them, and one hypothesis as well, maybe because they are essentially learning this underlying reality in some way. How is this alignment typically measured? So typically what we do is we build a kernel that's like a similarity matrix in a product matrix between the representations of these objects. So between these different visual objects here, for instance. And so we build one such kernel for each model, for each neural network, and then we compare them. So for instance, we have the Dino model and the Clip model. They both do vision embeddings. And maybe for both of them, the apple would be closer to the orange than the apple would be to the elephant. And that is essentially what this alignment measures. It measures how similar are these kernels in the sense that the apple somehow is closer to like the other fruit maybe, and the elephant is closer to the giraffe or so. And so what has been found is that these kinds of, well, it captures sort of what is important for classification or so, what is similar to which other thing, that kind of, there's a growing similarity between the models. The more data they are trained on, the more similar they somehow become. However, these alignments also, they're like not fully capturing all geometry because, well, one is like you can shift the data around, it's the same, or even like some of them are invariant to scaling and so on. So it doesn't directly mean that their embeddings are actually the same, but sort of the semantics of the embeddings are fairly similar. It also doesn't mean that they are not like distortions, that sort of some classes are sort of going in, like different classes are going in different directions, or whether there's a single distortion. So it doesn't tell me yet that much about, it tells me something about the very rough geometry of the data, but not at the more fine-grained level. So one question we posed is, if you look at these different models, do they actually really align? So if you look at the embeddings of the different classes, could you find a very simple way to go from one model to the other? Let's assume for the moment they're in the same dimension. Or is it that for each class you have to like skew it a little bit and pull it in different directions? Or is there like some very simple thing? Does it have to be linear or nonlinear, for instance? And now this becomes even more interesting if you talk about multimodal models, because this talk is about multimodality. So the way often these multimodal models are trained is by alignment of vision and text, for instance, or sequences, whatever. Like we had this different graph embeddings you can align, etc. So now the question is, what even if you have multimodal embeddings? Now I have a text embedding in both models and an image embedding in both models. How do they correspond? Now there's relations between my modalities, of course, because I tried to align them, and relations across the models. And so the question is, what does this even mean now if you do multimodality? Now we have basically 4 different things that I could align. And why is this not a trivial question? So the first thing, I mean, you may say is, well, what does this clip model essentially try to do? It tries to align the image with its corresponding caption. So ideally, maybe it would like to put them pretty much in the same point in my representation space. And in this case, it's essentially just, again, the same representation. And I could think about it as just having these 2 unimodal models. However, this is not generally the case. So there's this thing called the modality gap. And what is known is that if you look at the embeddings of image and text, even in these contrastive models, they are not on top of each other. They are separated in some ways. So this is what these visualizations show here. So it's not that the image is exactly on top of the text. No, there's some gap between them. There's maybe some kind of systematic gap, but there's a gap. So it's not exactly the same thing. So if we explore a bit further, in fact, we could have the following. So here are two models. These are the two different versions of CLIP trained on different data. And now we look at the image embedding and the text embedding of the same thing. So you see, you have this modality gap, but if I now wanted to align the text with the text just from CLIP to the OpenAI to the Lion model, I mean, coarsely it is the same, but you see there's like some, maybe fish and baby are closer in one than in the other, or the apple is a little bit further and so on. So they don't align, maybe they align maybe okay, but they shift around a bit. But then if I look at the relations between the text and image, they actually remain fairly stable. So what I mean with this is, if now I would actually look, instead of is the apple close to the orange, I would look at what's the relation between the apple and the image caption, and this caption and the different images. So I would get this multimodal kernel. This is what I mean with these brackets. And what we find is that these multimodal kernels are somehow approximately preserved. So somehow the angular arrangement of the text with respect to the images somehow is fairly stable. So somehow their relationship between the different ones. Okay, so this goes essentially beyond this, beyond the Platonic representation hypothesis. The Platonic hypothesis says we have basically the text embeddings in the two models, there's some correspondence between them. And the image embeddings in the two models, there's some correspondence between them. But what about the relation between these two different, like, is there maybe the same, could I align them with the same map or so? It doesn't say anything about that. So what we found indeed is that they are very related. So here is a picture of this, and then I'll show you some theory and some experiments. So the idea is the following. So we have the two models, and often like their kernels align. So the apple is close to the orange, the elephant is close to the giraffe. What we found is that under some conditions, in many cases, you can find a simple linear mapping between the, say, text embeddings of one model and the text embeddings of the other model, or between the images in one model and the images in the other model. And now the other thing is, so for contrastive models, this is actually just a rotation. It's just an orthogonal matrix. Now, the other interesting thing is, because of the way these multimodal kernels are, the mappings are the same. So I could learn a correspondence map between model A and model B in the image domain. And I could use that same map to translate the text of one model to the text in the other model, and so on. So this Q is the same translation between the models in both modalities. So it's very, very stiff in a way. So let me show you now some of the theory related to this. So the first one says that actually their kernels, these multimodal kernels, they correspond to each other in many cases. So if we assume, for instance, there is this shared underlying ground truth, then even if each model sees perturbations of the same ground truth distribution, so it sees more images, more of certain images, more of certain texts, etc., it's okay. They learn essentially the optimal similarity by the contrastive objective would be that they're essentially sharing this similarity measure. So the cross-modal kernel, which you see here in this image, is like in my illustration, the apples, like the text and the images the relation between text and image is similar in the two models. So this is going to happen if they learn essentially from the same underlying shared world model. So what does this mean? So now the kernels are approximately corresponding, and that is essentially enough. So in fact, if this is happening on some anchor sets, then in fact what you can find is that I can translate the images from one model to the other by a simple orthogonal matrix. So it's just a linear transformation, no distortion, weird big distortion of anything in any direction. And the other interesting thing is that the same map works for the other modality. So because of this multimodal kernel alignment, I basically have the same thing, the same orthogonal map that translates between one model and the other across the different modalities. That's what it means. Okay, if I don't do contrastive learning and I don't have normalized embeddings, you can find a slightly generalized version of this which uses a linear map. So you can still find corresponding linear maps. You'll just have a little bit of scaling in there. So now let's look at, I just have a few minutes left. Let's look at a few experiments. So we used a few of these different multimodal models. This is all image and text, but I think it would be very interesting to look at this in other modalities as well that are more interesting maybe for sciences, just like we did in the diffusion model. So what the first set of experiments shows here is just if I want to align between the models, just the images between the models, for instance. I don't care about the text for the moment. Can I do this with an orthogonal map? And this is essentially what this shows. Without alignment, the cosine similarity between two representations of the same image is pretty small, but after alignment, it's pretty high. Same as with retrieval, without alignment, it's basically, I mean, I ask like a query image, I see what are the nearest neighbors, what class do they come from. It's pretty bad. And if I align them with a rotation, I get really good, I mean, pretty good performance, like 95% or so. So that means they are really, like the classes are really well aligned after the rotation. So the rotation captures a lot of the information there. So this was in a single modality. So this basically shows that a simple rotation can do the job. And it's close, I mean, it's basically, you can get that from via SVD. The second thing is here about now I add another modality. And now what I do is I basically translate this map Q. So I learn it in one modality and I translate it into the other modality. So for instance, what this image aligned text means here, it means I'm taking an image and I'm looking what is the closest text, but from the other model, like model A image, and then model B's text was translated into model A, and I see what's the closest text, and I see do they correspond to each other. And I mean, it's not as good as you do it in the same model, but it's pretty good in terms of like what it does, and it's much better than if you don't align them. And the text retrieval is just the same as before. So I basically rotate the text with the same Q and as the images. So I invert it in images and then I use it on text, and it actually works pretty well on the text as well. And you can do a little bit of correction if your distributions are very different. But this one I think is even without that. So basically this means also empirically, actually the same map, if I infer it in one modality, I can use it in the other modality and just translate over the embeddings of one model into the space of the other model. So what this plot shows is that how many data points or classes do you need to learn this or infer this map? I said you can do it in one modality and translate into the other modality, but you can do it on a pretty small fraction of your data. So if you look at the yellow and the green line, basically after like 10 classes, you are as good as it gets. So out of like many of the classes that you have, it's enough to just look at a small fraction of your data from a few classes, and that helps you infer that map Q, and you can use it on the rest of your data. So it's pretty cheap, pretty easy to do. And my last plot here is to show how good or exact this map actually is. So what you could do is let's say X are the images in this case, and Y is the text. So you could take an image and you have inferred your map Q on the images, and you translate this image from model A to model B. And then you say, give me the nearest neighbors. So this is what's shown here. So you have the query image, it's a Chihuahua, and you look at the nearest neighbors in the embedding space of the second model, of the green model. And you see it makes a lot of sense. I mean, they are pretty reasonable. They're pretty close. The other thing we do now is we take the same image and we make a caption from it. So now we translate it into text modality in the same model, in model A. Then we translate the text to model B. This is this one here. And then we translate the text back into an image in model B. So what we use now is we use the cross-model translation at the text level, but we also use the relation between text and image in the two models. So we translate the text, and then we translate back from the text on the right-hand side to the image and use the other model's translation between text and image. And if you look at it, I mean, it's not like as close, but it's pretty good. So this is the query image. You translate it into a caption, then the caption here and so on. So it does the indirection via text, but the models that it retrieves, the images that it retrieves are actually quite reasonable. So this means that actually this has this commuting structure. So it really captures a lot of the structure of these maps. There's a lot of stiffness in there that you can do basically just the rotation to get from one to the other. And sort of the relation between image and text is always pretty similar across the models as well. So what are the implications? Well, one is you can basically now translate between models or use image from one and text from the other, whichever one has maybe the better partial encoder-decoder structure. With that, I'm out of time, so let me summarize. I showed you that multimodal data can be useful in many different ways for diffusion models, to improve unimodal data performance, and also that there's a lot of relationship across models between in the multimodal structure. There are many interesting questions, like how generalizing many of these results between vision and language to more interesting domains to explore what is shared and so on. And I would just want to acknowledge my student Sharut, who was the lead author on all these papers and who deserves some special recognition here. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Stefanie. Questions? And I know there's 10 people online, so if you're online and have a question, please feel free to turn your microphone on and ask. One of the things I wanted to ask was whether it's possible at all to know in advance whether a different modality of data is going to improve your predictions, or whether that's something you just have to find out by training a model.
Do we know which modality would improve it? Sometimes maybe you have some intuition that it'll have some complementary information. Otherwise, I guess I'm not sure how you would do this. It's a good question. What we observed though is it doesn't typically harm. So it may not help a lot, but it doesn't typically harm them. So it may just like remain pretty much the same. I think for the text and image, there is, I mean, there's some intuition that you may have why text helps the image, because it captures some things like where does the bird typically live or so. That's not as easy to get from the image. But it may not always be that straightforward. I think in the diffusion model thing, it was also because the modalities were pretty related, right? In the inverse folding or so, you know, there's the structure in the sequence, and somehow if you anyways are trying to do this job, it would help you to see both modalities in the representation and align both. But it could be that it's not as clear, yeah. That is true. It's a good question.
Thanks. Please.
All right. So for the first project you shared, have you tried to do any ablation studies on the quality of this additional model that you use and see how that influenced the improvement?
Right. We did some ablations. I have to look back at the paper. I think somewhere we had something, and it does, I mean, I would expect that the worse the more noise you have or so, the worse it'll become. But I think we did something like that, but I have to check that. Like, it's a while ago that we did those experiments.
There's one more question from Tom.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was wondering, other than, ablation studies where you remove one modality, what are your thoughts on the best methods out there to understand the added value of a given modality, if you have access to several for a given problem?
Oh, to see which one would be the most useful, I guess?
No, not necessarily the most, but exactly to understand what a given modality adds that the others didn't really have. Because, I mean, a lot of them provide similar information, right? And so
Yeah.
I think it can quickly become a non-trivial question, right? And ablation studies give you one way of just saying, okay, I have this drop in performance, but in terms of interpretable machine learning, etc., like what are your thoughts on the best, most systematic way of understanding the added value of a given modality?
Yeah, so one way you could approach this is a little bit like we did here. So this is from the theoretical perspective, that you make this assumption, you have this underlying like theta c or so, and then you're trying to make inference about it. And maybe in some modality, different directions or aspects of it are better represented than in the other one. And then this is how you could formally prove this. So this is essentially what this is doing. So this is theoretically, this would be one way to do this theoretically. So you could basically say, okay, certain directions like are more exposed in one modality than the other. If you want to do this empirically, this is a little harder because we don't really know what this is. So you can only see basically how much does performance increase or so. Or how much does your representation change when the other modality is added or so. If you just look at it a priori per se, let's say you have a modality-specific model for each of them. You could see how well they correspond to each other, and that may tell you something about the complementarity. But it could be that one is just, you don't know if the second one is better or worse. It may be just more noisy, so it's actually the worst one. So yeah, that's a good question. So you could, of course, add it to the modality and test and say, okay, my increase in performance or the change in my representation by some measure of quality or so, that is how much it changes. So you could make up some metrics like that, I think. That would be another way. Empirically, how you could do it, how much does your performance increase, if you add this modality, something like these. But that's that is now task specific, etc. But it could give you some guidance for doing this for different tasks, or maybe analyzing the representations by some quality measure like the clusteredness or something like that, and seeing how they change when you add this modality, things like that you could do.
Great. So let's thank Stefanie again. Thank you.